You've seen it in every medieval torture museum from London to Prague. That horrifying chair covered in iron spikes, designed to impale victims from every angle. The tour guide tells you it's from the 13th century. The placard says it was used during the Inquisition. Hollywood shows it in every medieval dungeon scene. There's just one problem. The medieval torture chair never existed. Not in the Middle Ages. Not during the Inquisition. Not ever. It's one of history's most successful frauds. A Victorian forgery so convincing that even today, museums display these fake artifacts as genuine medieval relics. In Ash Crown History, we're exposing one of the greatest hoaxes in museum history. A lie so pervasive that it has shaped how millions of people understand the medieval period. If you're fascinated by the real truth behind historical myths and the dark corners of museum fraud, subscribe to Ash Crown History and ring the notification bell. Because what you're about to learn will make you question every medieval artifact you've ever seen. The year is 1890. You're walking through the newly opened Medieval Crime Museum in Rothenburg, Germany. In the center of the torture chamber exhibit sits an imposing iron chair, bristling with over 500 sharp spikes. The museum guide, speaking in hushed tones, explains how victims were forced to sit on this monstrous device, the spikes penetrating their flesh from every angle. Blood would flow through carefully designed channels. Death would take hours, sometimes days. Visitors gasp in horror. Ladies fan themselves. Gentlemen shake their heads at the barbarity of their ancestors. The chair becomes the museum's star attraction, drawing thousands of tourists eager to glimpse the dark reality of medieval justice. Newspapers across Europe publish illustrations. Other museums scramble to acquire their own torture chairs. Within a decade, these sinister seats appear in collections from London to Vienna. But here's what those Victorian tourists didn't know. The chair they were viewing with such fascination wasn't medieval at all. It had been manufactured just 3 years earlier in a workshop in Nuremberg, artificially aged with chemicals and false rust, then sold to the museum as a genuine 14th century artifact. The creator? A furniture maker named Johann Baptist Schütz, who discovered that manufacturing fake medieval torture devices was far more profitable than making actual furniture. To understand how this massive deception took root, we need to examine the Victorian era's peculiar obsession with medieval brutality. The late 19th century saw an explosion of interest in the Middle Ages, but not the real Middle Ages of trade guilds, agricultural innovation, and scholastic philosophy. The Victorians wanted darkness. They wanted dungeons. They wanted proof that their modern, industrialized world had evolved from a past of unimaginable cruelty. This appetite for medieval horror created a booming market for torture artifacts. Museums, desperate to attract visitors in an age before government funding, needed sensational displays. Private collectors, eager to shock dinner party guests, sought the most gruesome pieces. And where genuine artifacts didn't exist, enterprising forgers were happy to create them. The torture chair became the crown jewel of this deception. Unlike genuine medieval torture devices, which were typically simple and functional, the torture chair was theatrical. It was designed not to actually torture anyone, but to look as terrifying as possible to paying museum visitors. The spikes were carefully positioned to create maximum visual impact while actually making the chair completely impractical as a torture device. Any real torturer would have known that a victim would pass out from blood loss within minutes. defeating the purpose of extracting a confession. But the forgers weren't trying to fool medieval torturers. They were targeting Victorian audiences who had no real knowledge of historical torture practices. These audiences had been primed by Gothic novels and sensationalist newspaper accounts to expect elaborate mechanical devices. The torture chair delivered exactly what they expected to see. Let's examine the most famous example, the iron chair of the Nuremberg Museum. First displayed in 1893, this chair was presented as having been used in the dungeons of Nuremberg Castle since 1350. The museum claimed it had documentary evidence linking the chair to over 200 executions. Visitors could even see what appeared to be ancient bloodstains on the spikes. The truth, uncovered by historian Wolfgang Schild in 1982, was far more mundane. The chair had been commissioned by the museum's director, Heinrich Zimmermann, who provided detailed specifications to a local metalworker. The ancient bloodstains were a mixture of rust and pig's blood, applied just days before the museum's opening. The documentary evidence was forged, created by an unemployed clerk who specialized in manufacturing fake medieval manuscripts for collectors. But Nuremberg wasn't alone. The Tower of London acquired its torture chair in 1887 from a dealer named Thomas Isley, who claimed to have discovered it in a forgotten chamber of an Irish castle. The Museo della Tortura in San Gimignano proudly displayed 3 different torture chairs, each supposedly from a different century. Prague Castle's exhibition featured a particularly elaborate version with mechanical moving parts that could supposedly tighten around the victim. None of these chairs were real. Every single one was a 19th century creation, manufactured to meet the demand for medieval horror. But how did so many museums fall for such obvious fakes? The answer lies in the state of historical scholarship in the Victorian era. Medieval studies were still in their infancy. Few scholars could read medieval Latin or Old German scripts. Carbon dating hadn't been invented. Museums relied primarily on dealers and donors for authentication, and these sources had every incentive to confirm an artifact's authenticity. A genuine medieval torture chair could sell for the equivalent of 100,000 in today's money. A Victorian reproduction was worth perhaps 500. Moreover, the torture chair fit perfectly with Victorian prejudices about the medieval period. The 19th century viewed itself as the pinnacle of civilization, having emerged from centuries of barbarism. The torture chair confirmed this narrative. It proved that medieval people were cruel, primitive, and savage, unlike the enlightened Victorians who would never tolerate such brutality. Never mind that Victorian England still practiced public hangings, or that British colonial forces were simultaneously engaged in systematic torture across the empire. The myth of the torture chair was also sustained by a fundamental misunderstanding of how medieval justice actually worked. Real medieval torture was typically simple and practical. The rack stretched joints. Thumbscrews crushed digits. The strapado dislocated shoulders. These devices were effective because they caused intense pain while allowing the torturer to control the level of damage. They could be stopped instantly if the victim agreed to confess. A chair covered in spikes fails on every practical level. The victim would be unable to speak coherently through the pain. Blood loss would quickly lead to unconsciousness. The torturer would have no way to escalate or reduce the suffering. Most importantly, the sheer complexity and expense of creating such a device would be prohibitive in an era when a simple rope and pulley could achieve the same confession. But the Victorian forgers weren't thinking about practical torture. They were creating props for a morality play about the progress of civilization. Each spike on the chair represented another step humanity had taken from barbarism to enlightenment. The more elaborate the torture device, the more superior the Victorian visitor could feel about their own refined sensibilities. The creation of fake torture chairs became an entire industry. In Prague, a workshop run by the Hexler family produced over 50 torture chairs between 1880 and 1910. They developed techniques for artificial aging using acid baths and controlled rusting. They studied genuine medieval metalwork to replicate authentic construction methods. They even created fake provenance documents, complete with artificial wormholes and period-appropriate ink. In England, a company called Medieval Reproductions Ltd. openly advertised their services in museum trade journals. Their catalogue, discovered in the British Library archives, offers authentic reproduction torture devices for educational display. The torture chair section alone runs to 12 pages, with options ranging from a basic model with 100 spikes to a deluxe version with 1,000 spikes and optional heating elements to create a more dramatic display. The museums knew. They had to know. Internal correspondence from the period, now held in various archives, reveals curator concerns about authenticity. A letter from the British Museum's Medieval Department in 1895 notes that the so-called torture chair recently offered for purchase shows suspicious signs of modern manufacture. Yet museums continued to acquire and display these chairs. Why? The answer is simple: visitors loved them. Attendance figures from the period show that museums with torture exhibits drew 3 times more visitors than those focusing on medieval art or manuscripts. The torture chair, usually positioned as the centerpiece of the torture chamber, was invariably the most popular display. Museums that refused to include torture devices on ethical or authenticity grounds saw their attendance plummet. This created a vicious cycle. The public expected to see torture chairs because they had seen them in other museums. Museums felt obligated to display torture chairs to meet public expectations. The more torture chairs that appeared in museums, the more their existence seemed confirmed. By 1900, the torture chair had become such an established part of the medieval narrative that questioning its authenticity seemed absurd. The myth was further reinforced by popular culture. Novels like Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame depicted medieval dungeons filled with elaborate torture devices. These descriptions, based on Victorian museum displays rather than historical research, created a feedback loop. Writers described torture chairs because they had seen them in museums. Museums acquired torture chairs because visitors expected to see the devices they had read about in books. Even academic historians were fooled. The German historian Gustav Freytag included detailed descriptions of torture chairs in his influential 1859 work, Pictures of German Life. The English historian Luke Owen Pike devoted an entire chapter to spike-covered torture devices in his 1873 History of Crime in England. These scholarly endorsements gave the torture chair academic credibility that would persist for generations. The first serious challenge to the torture chair myth came in 1931 from an unexpected source. A German locksmith named Heinrich Kramer, who was hired to repair the famous Nuremberg torture chair. Upon dismantling the device, Kramer discovered modern tool marks, 19th-century screws, hidden beneath fake medieval bolt heads. and a manufacturer's stamp from a Bavarian ironworks that hadn't existed before 1876. Kramer's discovery should have ended the myth, but museums were reluctant to admit they had been displaying fakes. The Nuremberg Museum quietly moved their torture chair to storage but issued no public statement. Other museums simply ignored Kramer's findings. Some even doubled down, producing new documentation to prove their chairs were genuine. World War II temporarily ended the debate as many museums were destroyed and their collections scattered. But in the post-war period, the torture chair returned with a vengeance. Museums rebuilding their collections eagerly acquired any torture devices they could find, asking few questions about provenance. The torture chair myth entered a new phase, now blessed with the patina of age that made the Victorian forgeries seem more authentic. It wasn't until the 1960s that systematic scholarly investigation began to dismantle the torture chair myth. The medievalist Ernst Schubert examined every known torture chair in European museums, subjecting them to metallurgical analysis and construction techniques. His conclusion was damning. Not a single chair showed evidence of medieval manufacture. Every one displayed clear signs of 19th century origin. Yet even today the myth persists. Museums in Prague, San Gimignano, and Toledo continue to display torture chairs as medieval artifacts. Tourist guides repeat the same stories told by their Victorian predecessors. Websites devoted to medieval history include detailed descriptions of torture chairs, complete with fabricated accounts of their use. The myth has become so embedded in popular consciousness that reality seems like revisionism. Why does this matter? Because the torture chair myth fundamentally distorts our understanding of medieval justice and society. Real medieval torture, while certainly brutal by modern standards, was heavily regulated and relatively rare. The use of torture required specific legal procedures and was typically reserved for the most serious crimes. The image of dungeons filled with elaborate torture devices waiting to ensnare anyone who displeased the authorities is pure fantasy. Moreover, the torture chair myth perpetuates a dangerous narrative about historical progress. It suggests that the past was uniformly barbaric and that torture was abandoned as societies became more civilized. This comfortable fiction allows us to ignore contemporary torture practices and human rights abuses. If torture is medieval, then modern societies that practice torture must be medieval too, rather than confronting the reality that torture has never truly disappeared. The economic impact of the torture chair myth cannot be ignored either. Museums that display these fake artifacts continue to profit from them. The Medieval Crime Museum in Rothenburg, built entirely around its collection of forged torture devices, attracts over 250,000 visitors annually. The San Gimignano Torture Museum charges €10 admission to view its collection of Victorian fakes. These institutions have a financial incentive to maintain the myth. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the torture chair myth is how it shapes our imagination of the past. When we think of medieval justice, we picture spike-covered chairs rather than complex legal procedures. When we imagine medieval dungeons, we see elaborate mechanical devices rather than simple cells. The fake has become more real than reality itself. The torture chair also reveals uncomfortable truths about the Victorian era that created it. The same society that prided itself on moral progress and civilized values was obsessed with creating and viewing representations of torture. Victorian museum-goers who shuddered at the barbarity of the torture chair would leave the museum to watch public executions or read newspaper accounts of colonial atrocities. The torture chair served as a projection of their own society's violence onto a safely distant past. Modern forensic analysis has revealed just how sophisticated these Victorian forgeries were. X-ray examination shows that many torture chairs were constructed using genuine medieval metalworking techniques, suggesting that forgers studied authentic medieval artifacts to make their creations more convincing. Some chairs incorporate actual medieval nails and fittings, probably salvaged from demolished buildings, to add authenticity. The chemical aging processes used were remarkably advanced. Forgers used combinations of acid, salt water, and organic compounds to create realistic rust patterns. They buried newly made chairs in manure piles to create authentic-looking corrosion. They even introduced period-appropriate tool marks using replicas of medieval implements. This level of detail suggests an organized industry rather than isolated fraudsters. Recent discoveries in museum archives have revealed the extent of institutional complicity in perpetuating the torture chair myth. Internal memoranda from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, dating from 1924, show that curators were aware their torture chair was of doubtful authenticity, but chose to display it anyway because it was educationally valuable. Similar documents from museums across Europe reveal a pattern of willful blindness to the truth. The torture chair myth has even infected academic historiography. Surveys of medieval history textbooks published between 1850 and 1950 show that over 60 include references to torture chairs as historical fact. These textbooks, many still in circulation in updated editions, have educated generations of students about a device that never existed. The myth has literally been taught as truth. Consider the case of the famous iron chair of Constance, supposedly used to execute Jan Hus in 1415. This chair, destroyed during World War II, was venerated as a relic of religious persecution. Pilgrims traveled to see it. Historians wrote learned papers about its construction. Protestant reformers cited it as evidence of Catholic brutality. Yet analysis of pre-war photographs using modern forensic techniques proves conclusively that the chair was manufactured no earlier than 1880. The psychology behind the torture chair's enduring appeal deserves examination. Why are people so willing to believe in something so obviously impractical? The answer may lie in what psychologists call confirmation bias. The torture chair confirms our preconceptions about the medieval period. It validates our sense of historical progress. It provides a tangible artifact for abstract concepts of medieval cruelty. Once established in our minds, the image becomes resistant to contradiction. There's also an element of horror attraction. Humans have always been fascinated by representations of suffering and death. The torture chair provides a safe way to confront these dark fascinations. It's distant enough in time to avoid immediate moral discomfort, but concrete enough to provide visceral thrills. The museum setting legitimizes what would otherwise be considered morbid curiosity. The torture chair myth also serves political purposes. During the Reformation, Protestants used images of torture chairs to attack Catholic authority. During the Enlightenment, philosophers cited torture chairs as evidence of religious barbarism. In the 19th century, liberals used torture chairs to argue for legal reform. The mythical chair became a real political weapon. Even in the 21st century, the torture chair continues to evolve. Modern reproductions, sold online as medieval replicas, are now entering the antique market. These contemporary fakes of Victorian fakes are being sold to collectors as genuine artifacts. The myth has become a multi-generational deception, each iteration adding another layer of false authenticity. Digital technology has given the torture chair myth new life. Video games set in medieval periods invariably include torture chairs in their dungeon scenes. Virtual museum tours feature detailed 3D models of torture chairs complete with fictional histories. Social media spreads images of torture chairs with captions describing their supposed use. The digital age has made the myth more pervasive than ever. The fight against the torture chair myth continues. Serious historians regularly debunk these devices in academic publications that few people read. Meanwhile, popular media continues to perpetuate the myth to millions. It's an unequal battle between truth and entertainment, scholarship and sensationalism. Some museums have begun to address the issue honestly. The Museum of Medieval Justice in Rothenburg now includes a section on myths and forgeries that explains how torture chairs were created and why they're not authentic. The London Dungeon, while still displaying torture chairs, now clearly labels them as Victorian interpretations rather than genuine artifacts. These small steps toward honesty are encouraging but insufficient. The real tragedy of the torture chair myth is what it obscures. Medieval justice, while certainly harsh by modern standards, was far more complex and regulated than the torture chair suggests. Real medieval legal procedures, with their emphasis on oath-taking, compurgation, and communal judgment, tell us far more about medieval society than any spiked chair ever could. But these authentic practices lack the visual drama of a torture chair. We must also confront why the Victorians were so eager to believe in and create these torture chairs. What psychological need did these fabrications fulfill? The answer reveals as much about Victorian society as it does about our continued willingness to believe in them. The torture chair is a mirror reflecting not medieval reality but modern anxieties about progress, civilization, and human nature. As we stand in the 21st century, surrounded by new myths and fabrications spreading at digital speed, the lesson of the torture chair becomes more relevant than ever. It reminds us to question what we think we know, to demand evidence for extraordinary claims, and to recognize that sometimes the most widely believed facts are the ones most deserving of scrutiny. The medieval torture chair never existed. It was never used during the Inquisition, never filled the dungeons of medieval castles, never extracted confessions from heretics. It exists only in Victorian workshops, modern museums, and our collective imagination. Yet, in a sense, its non-existence makes it more historically significant than many genuine artifacts. It tells us not what the medieval world was, but what we need it to have been. The next time you visit a museum and see a medieval torture chair, remember that you're not looking at history. You're looking at a Victorian fantasy, a commercialized nightmare, a profitable lie. The real horror isn't the spikes or the iron or the supposed suffering of medieval victims. The real horror is how easily we believe what we want to believe, how readily we accept the darkness we project onto the past. Thank you for joining us on this investigation into one of history's most persistent frauds. If you found this exploration enlightening and want to uncover more historical myths and hidden truths, please subscribe to Ash Crown History. Hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss our investigations into the lies, forgeries, and forgotten truths that shape our understanding of the past. Remember, history isn't just what happened. It's what we believe happened. And sometimes, what we believe reveals more about us than any truth ever could. The torture chair may be fake, but the willingness to believe in it is all too real. This has been Ash Crown History, uncovering the stories they didn't want you to know, and sometimes the stories that never were.